Welcome back to Ben on Politics. My name is Ben Garves, a former congressional candidate and current social rights activist. This is a weekly or bi-weekly or really whenever I want to do a web series talking about the world of politics. This week we're going to talk a little bit about the political spectrum and how you've probably got it all wrong. Don't worry though, everyone does and you're here to learn. Let's do it. The political spectrum, as you know it, is a left-to-right scale with liberals on the left and conservatives on the right. Historically, we could talk about how we got there. In the 1790s, French legislative bodies had the speaker seated in front of the assembly, with the aristocracy on the right and the commoners on the left. It divided those supporting the royal family and the church interests from those supporting civil liberties and the common man and woman. The 18th century political spectrum was, on average, much more conservative than our current spectrum because, after the falls of Greece in 529 AD and Rome in 1453, a period of European colonialism was led by governments made up of monarchies, aristocracies, and plutocracies. Don't worry, I know what you're thinking. You don't remember what those are from middle school history classes. I've got your back. Constitutional and absolute monarchies are run by a noble bloodline, like kings and queens. Aristocracies are run by those deemed to be of a social ruling class, typically separating elite families from common families. And then finally, plutocracies are run by the rich and elite economic classes and not by the poor. Political spectrums are much more conservative then than they are today because decoupling from elitism-based governments move you further toward the left, empowering the common man and woman. There are still exceptions, though, in a modern democracy, like Donald Trump's hybridized plutocracy, in the way that he's placed unelected cabinet officials of wealthy families into our government. Now let's take a look at presidents. The last 11 who served were rated on a scale of 0 to 10 on their respective sides of the spectrum based on how they ran the country during their presidency. From left to right, Obama and Carter were the most liberal with scores of 6. Truman was barely liberal at 1, Nixon slightly conservative at 1.8, and George W. Bush the most conservative at 6.8. Here's a peek at all 11, and I'll go full screen for you to take a peek. Now, recent candidates have also been ranked from left to right. Sanders was the most liberal at 8.3. Relative to that, Obama was only a 3.9 when he campaigned. And on the other end of the spectrum, Ted Cruz ranked as scary 9.7, or at least let's put that in context. It's a little more like that. Cruz was a scary 9.7 compared to Chris Christie, who was actually more of a moderate 2.5. And again, here's a full list of recent popular candidates for you to take a look at. If you're not perplexed by the ideas of numbers, the 2s plus 2s and whatnot, you're probably asking yourself why Obama campaigned as a 3.9 but led as a 6.5. This is called campaigning toward the moderate center. Here's a really good example on the conservative side. When George W. Bush ran for office in the primaries, he ran a much more hardline conservative campaign to the right of John McCain. In doing that, he mobilized a Republican base and heftily won Republican primaries in 44 states. Then the real challenge began. Bush had to overcome a presidential general election against a widely well-admired Vice President Al Gore in order to win the popular vote. To do that, Governor Bush would have to make concessions to the moderate voters in America. His campaign slowly meandered toward the left, and therefore the victory he was striving for. Bush didn't win the popular vote, but he did win the presidency, and with it, a chance to run for re-election 4 years later. What followed was a drastically moderate presidency. I say this in hindsight, that a much more conservative agenda could have been implemented, considering he had both a Republican Congress and a national crisis he could publicize for that agenda. By the end of the first 4 years, he had enough votes to garner a victory over John Kerry, but the damage was already done to his party. A conservative base so direly hoping Bush was the real deal had already been mobilized to find candidates more in line with their Christian right values. This was the birth of what became known as the Tea Party. The saga was documented in a book called The Strange Death of Republican America by Sidney Blumenthal. In 2008, we witnessed a very different Republican Party, one that was torn by infighting between super conservative Tea Party individuals and the moderate right. Blumenthal was right that the party was fractured, but the book couldn't predict a politically confused candidate like Donald Trump would run in 2016. This is where the liberal story comes in. An awakening of social America wanted Bernie Sanders and his message of social and racial equality over the known force that was Hillary Clinton. Regardless, moderate liberal voters managed to nominate Clinton for the presidency. Probably the only Democrat in their arsenal 100% of moderate Republicans would refuse to vote for. This essentially left a torn Republican Party actually unanimously in agreement against a candidate. And now also the Democrats separated into social and moderate subgroups. Let's go back to the basics. The left to right scale is what we call the social scale. It ranks how an individual feels about protecting social rights. The more to the left you are, the more you support what's called the social contract, the idea that people are responsible for taking care of each other. The further to the right you are on the scale, the more you believe everyone should look out for themselves and disregard their fellow man and woman. What we commonly forget, and absolutely the most important part of this video, is that there are other axes on the political spectrum. There's the north-south axis, or the up and down axis. It officially has to do with how much liberty you believe a person should have. Should they be free to make their own decisions regarding everything? I would say probably not. You'd probably want someone to be arrested for murder and banks to be regulated against predatory lending. But how would you feel about a national curfew or being told how many kids you can have? The opposite end of the vertical scale has to do with what's called totalitarianism, the idea that the government should have total control over our lives. Why is this so important? Because we don't group our politicians correctly. We want to say only a Republican will balance a budget, or only a liberal will give you universal health care. But Donald Trump will actually outspend Barack Obama. Paul Ryan introduced an albeit limited universal health care bill, and Ted Cruz wrote the bill this year authorizing NASA's budget. Yes, Barack Obama was a liberal president, but his approach to civil liberties is to let those not treading on each other have the freedom to carry about their lives unconstrained. A libertarian approach. And yes, Donald Trump is heavily conservative with his policies, saying he believes in personal responsibility. But his approach to the north-south scale is drastically totalitarian and pro-revoking the rights of anyone not in line with his belief system. Adolf Hitler, while claiming to be from a leftist party, was heavily conservative and operated a totalitarian state, much like the policies of Donald Trump. While conservatives like Paul Rand are the vertical opposite, believing in elimination of the federal government. And for the other side, Hillary Clinton is an advocate of some of the law and order rhetoric that would put her slightly more totalitarian on a scale than Barack Obama. We have such an oblique drive to fit two-dimensional labels into a three-dimensional candidate. I'm a Democrat, but I believe not a single dollar should be spent outside of a balanced budget. I believe personal freedoms are just as important as protecting us from crime. That doesn't necessarily make me a Republican, though. I believe we should focus the majority of our efforts on funding schools and our sciences to make sure our next generations are the greatest generations in American history. That makes me a Democrat. I also believe that we can do a lot to eliminate a drastically overgrown federal government without cutting the teeth out of our agencies that protect Americans from predatory corporations. That makes me a liberal Democrat that believes in social liberty. What are you? Take a look at the scale. This has been an episode of Ben on Politics, and I'm your host, Ben Garves. Thank you for tuning in.